On Writing by Stephen King, the book wherein one of the best selling authors of modern times discourses on his relationship to the craft of writing and provides advice and reveals to the reader some tricks of the trade. Now, this was a reread for me. I had read this book years ago, and I remember having kind of mixed feelings regarding it. But I wanted to reread it because this book is, whether for good or ill, a massively popular book when it comes to instruction manuals or advice books pertaining to the craft of writing. Like, this book is kind of an unofficial Bible to many a would-be writer out there. And having done a little bit more writing of my own between having read this book the first time and now, like I say, I wanted to reread it and see how I felt towards it now. And I have to say, I think there is quite a bit of valuable advice that King gives in this, but also still have some points which I would contest. So, for the purposes of this review, I will be excluding the memoir sections of this book because On Writing is not just a book of advice on writing, it is also something of a memoir of Stephen King detailing, his life from childhood to becoming a successful writer, a wildly successful writer, and then getting nearly killed in an automotive accident in 1999. But I'm going to exclude that because I skipped all that when I reread this book this time. Stephen King's life is pretty mundane, not all that interesting, and I really didn't want to read through all his various anecdotes again, so I skipped that. I just read the parts of the book which are actually about writing, and so that is what I'm going to confine the review of the book to being about. So, Stephen King gives some advice in here which I myself would not contest in the slightest. Like, he says that you should always use active voice whenever possible. Don't use passive voice because that's a sign of a weak and oftentimes kind of an insecure writer. And I would agree with that. Always use active voice if you can. It makes the story feel much more forceful and engaging. So no contest there. And he also advises against overusing adverbs. And again, I would agree with that. Now, that's not to say that adverbs should be, entirely eschewed, but contextually, you should probably be able to infer the manner in which some actions are performed without having to explicitly attach an adverb to a verb to qualify it. So I agree with that by and large, and also I would agree with Stephen King's assessment that dialogue is perhaps the most crucial part of a story, and that some writers are much more adept at mastering the art of dialogue than others. And I would, even though I have been quite critical of Stephen King in the past, I would wholeheartedly concede that Stephen King is absolutely a very talented author when it comes to writing dialogue. His dialogue feels very true to life, very realistic, and it is probably one of the most striking aspects of his writing. Now, I wish that he would keep the kind of colloquial nature of his dialogue writing strictly to the dialogue because it bleeds over into the broader narration of his books and becomes downright painful at times, in my opinion. But I wholeheartedly concede that Stephen King is by and large a pretty damn fine writer when it comes to dialogue. And I once again agree with him that it is possibly the most crucial part of a story because it has the potential to be the most revealing in terms of character. And again, some writers, such as H.P. Lovecraft, whom he critiques in this book, are not very good writers of dialogue. And like he says in this book, that's probably why H.P. Lovecraft wrote so little dialogue in his stories. His stories are by and large, almost entirely narration. So I would agree with that. And also, Stephen King gives some great advice when it comes to completing a draft of a manuscript, though you need to set it aside. And I have found myself that to be quite salient advice because with time comes perspective, right? And whenever you finish writing something, you would probably behoove yourself to set it aside, put it out of your mind if possible for a few weeks or so, and then come back to it with fresh eyes, a fresh perspective, and see what you make of it then. That is to say, once you finish writing something, you probably don't need to just immediately sit down and start trying to um, revise and proofread and everything. You really do need to kind of back away from it to try to, again, see it with a new perspective. And I wholeheartedly agree with that because you can have something that you think is just like freaking genius. You're like, this is the greatest thing ever written. And then you come back to it and you're like, oh, that was crap. It's kind of, when you're, flush with the thrill of success at having written something, you kind of can delude yourself perhaps into seeing it differently than you probably ought to see it. So I would agree with that as well. But as I said, even though I think there is a lot of great advice that Stephen King gives in this book, there's also some advice that I would have to contest. Starting off with just probably the most obvious thing that I would have to contest would be his advice on how much to write per day. Stephen King advises in this book that aspiring writers should write between 4 to 6 hours every day. And to that, I would just laugh hysterically. Like, Stephen King, you have to kind of step out of your ivory tower and recognize that your average person working a full time job with a family or trying to, make a relationship function does not probably have 4 to 6 hours every day to devote to writing. Maybe 2 hours, 1 hour, maybe even just like half an hour is probably the best that some people can do. So I think it's a little elitist of him to say, well, if you just don't want to devote 6 hours every day to writing, then you're just not serious about it. No, you can still be absolutely serious about it and do the best you can with whatever time you have at your disposal. So I would seriously have a bone to pick with that bit of advice because I think that is, again, very elitist and it's coming from the perspective of someone ensconced in their ivory tower. And also, Stephen King says that you should set a goal of writing. It's like 2,000 words a day. I think that's what he says in here. You should write a certain amount, and then you should not leave your little writerly retreat, wherever that may be, before you accomplish this goal. And again, I don't think that's necessarily valid. Speaking strictly for me, there's times when I'm just like good. I'm doing good just to get like a couple of sentences done. Again, because I guess it depends on whether you want to think things out before you actually set things down, or if you just want to kind of shotgun it out there and then you just pick the diamonds out of the muck later on. But for me, I don't think that's a I don't think that's necessarily a rule that you should have to set for yourself, that you have to write so much per day. I would go for quality over quantity myself. But also, Stephen King doesn't come outright and say this in the book, but you definitely do get the impression that he would advise you to be averse to using larger words, that your vocabulary should be not extravagant or overly large, but that you should confine yourself to kind of everyday words. Which is definitely what Stephen King does in his own writing. Now, again, he doesn't come right out and say, don't ever use like $10 words. And I would agree with him insofar as he does say in the book, don't ever be just flashy and showboaty and show off the fact that you have read the dictionary and you know more words than most people. Like, don't ever do that. But also do not be averse, I would say, to using larger caliber vocabulary in your writing, because bigger words often have bigger connotations and bigger meanings. So I don't think that one should. I don't think that one should necessarily adhere to that tenet of George Orwell's, which is to never use a big word where a small word will do. I don't think that holds. I think there are legitimate times where using, again, higher caliber vocabulary is perfectly justified. And again, Stephen King doesn't come outright and say just use plain simple English. Um, but you kind of do get the impression that he doesn't want people to use extravagant language. And again, you don't want to write purple prose, but bigger words, like I say, do have bigger definitions and bigger connotations, and they can really enrich your writing if used wisely. So that, for me, would be my bit of advice there as regarding that. But also, Stephen King says that one should never start writing with a theme, that you should always construct a story, a scenario, a premise, and characters first, and then you should uh, kind of extrapolate the theme from that. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that that's like bad advice in and of itself, I mean, you certainly can construct a story that way, and that's probably the way that most people do construct a story. But I just don't think that rule holds true 100% of the time. Like, all of the books of Dostoevsky's pretty much are books which I think it would be safe to say were conceived of explicitly as explorations of a certain theme. Likewise with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984. Like, these are books that were constructed from the ground up around a theme. I don't think that any of those books started out as a story and then their authors were like, this could actually explore this certain idea or this notion. No, I think those books were begun around theme, and then the story developed around that. So while I don't think that it's bad advice to, craft a premise, a scenario first, and then extract a theme from that as you go, I don't think that's necessarily bad advice. I just think that it's wrong to say that you can't do it the other way, because again, Dostoevsky's books are like some of the most highly regarded works of literature ever. And once again, they were all, I would say, begun with the intent of being explorations of a given theme. So I would, again, contest that. But my biggest point of contention when it comes to Stephen King's on writing has to do with his advice pertaining to plotting, or rather the lack thereof. And this is where I have to call bullshit. Because Stephen King advises the would-be writer in this book to not plot or outline a book. You craft your basic premise and you get your characters, and then you just go from there and you let it develop on its own. And while there is something to be said for that, that can also lead to disaster. And it has led to disaster for Stephen King himself on many occasions. Most notably and most egregiously, perhaps, with his book The Stand. Because The Stand is one of the most appallingly bad books in terms of the resolution of its plot. You can say the characters are lively and human, fair enough. You can say the premise is really engaging and it really sucks you in, fair enough. But you cannot say, and I mean it, you cannot say that that book wraps up in a satisfactory fashion, because that is some bullshit right there. The Stand, the ending to The Stand, not only it makes no sense whatsoever, but it also ends with possibly the single biggest deus ex machina in all of fiction, or at least the biggest that I have ever personally encountered. Yeah, it was some bullshit. And so whenever I read Stephen King give that little bit of advice, to say you should never outline or plot a book, you should just, come up with the basic premise and the characters and then just let it develop organically. I would say that is not something that you should take to heart, because, again, it has worked out horrendously for Stephen King himself. Given the fact that Stephen King is often lambasted for the unsatisfactory conclusions of his books. And again, The Stand is the most egregious example of that. because it's totally nonsensical. It is, again, just the biggest Deus Ex Machina ever, and it's just such a manifest case of a writer who wrote themselves into a corner and then had no clue how to resolve anything except, and then they all blow up. It was just stupid. And it was so stupid to see Stephen King give that bit of advice like that is something that you should actually, that's a life that you should actually steer by. No. Um, you can say, who are you to contest Stephen King? Fair enough, but I would strongly advise people out there not to be averse to plotting or outlining a story because while I think some stories you probably could do organically, especially if the stories aren't like plot driven stories like, I don't know, Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse. Like, who cares about plotting in those books because they don't even have a plot really to speak of. But when you're writing like mainstream commercial fiction, especially like crime fiction, that's why Stephen King's crime fiction falls short for me at least, because it's some things just develop a little bit too conveniently because he doesn't outline the story. But also, a story which is driven by a central conflict that has to be resolved and has to be resolved in a satisfactory fashion, you would do well to plot that story. And Stephen King likens the art of writing to paleontology, to unearthing a fossil. He says, you got to try to bring the fossil up out of the dirt, but we always have to remember, Stephen King might say that not all fossils are complete, right? That sometimes they have to be filled in. They don't always come up in one piece, right? Sometimes there are pieces missing. But the thing is, when it comes to paleontology, with the pieces of skeletons which are missing, we can generally kind of, figure out what's supposed to go in that place, like what it's supposed to look like. But some of Stephen King's books, and once again, I refer to The Stand foremost among them, it's like putting a bazooka on the tail of a triceratops because you don't know what the rest of the triceratops looks like. Like it doesn't even fit. Like the ending again to The Stand is, it just doesn't even make sense. It was a catastrophe of an ending to a book which was otherwise quite engrossing, and which kind of shat the bed at the end. So that would be my biggest disagreement with Stephen King when it comes to his writing advice is, some stories need to be plotted, definitely. Some stories need to be outlined. They need to be thought out ahead of time, or else they just, they just shit the bed like The Stand did, and like so many other of Stephen King's books have done. But anyway, so that's kind of my take on Stephen King's on writing. I think it has some really valuable advice to give, but I also think that some of its advice is sorely lacking. And I want to say this: when reading on writing, one would do well to remember that Stephen King is not so much advising you on how to write per se, rather, he is advising you on how to write like Stephen King. And even though Stephen King certainly has his merits, which I, even as kind of a critic of him, will readily acknowledge, he also has a crap load of faults too. And so I think it's good when reading this book to kind of take it with a grain of salt somewhat. But once again, this is a wildly popular book when it comes to the craft of writing. And once again, I think there is some seriously valuable stuff in here. It's just that, again, I think some of it doesn't hold up. And the reader, in my opinion, would be best served when reading this to not read it in a kind of worshipful frame of mind when it comes to Stephen King, because I know a lot of people out there will read this book just because they love Stephen King, and because Stephen King may be their favorite author, they will just hang on every word he says in this. And you really shouldn't do that, because Stephen King has quite a few faults when it comes to writing, and again, he has the potential to transmit those faults through this book to other people. So once again, pick this book up if it sounds interesting to you, if you are an aspiring writer, but please just read it with caution and with that grain of salt, because a lot of it you can take to heart, but some of it you really shouldn't. But anyway, so On Writing by Stephen King. Have you read the book. If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read On Writing, well, like I say, it is kind of an informal Bible for a lot of aspiring writers out there. And it's definitely very easily accessible because Stephen King writes in such a colloquial fashion that it doesn't feel like a lecture so much as it just feels like someone kind of standing over your shoulder and kind of helping you with some things. So that can be said in its favor. And like I said, you might want to pick this up definitely because some of its advice I think is very sound. But once again, please read it with that grain of salt because some of its advice I just think doesn't really hold up. But as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.